access will be one that the Germans will have to consider both a competitor for now restricted supplies of raw materials and a now denied end market. That might sound innocuous enough, but consider that such concerns were the driving rationale behind the last 6 wars the Germans initiated. World War II, World War I, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, and the Schleswig Wars of 1848-51 and 1864. Germany may not have much of a military at the present, but neither did it in 1935. Just 5 years before it conquered 8 of the 9 countries that it currently borders. This isn't Uzbekistan or Japan, where the requirements are nearby so the path is obvious. This isn't Saudi Arabia or Iran, where the threats and so the necessary steps to counter them are clear. Without Bretton Woods, Germany's mere existence is a threat to the very neighbors that Germany needs if it is to continue as a successful country. And under Bretton Woods, the German economy has grown so much that even a deal with all of them still wouldn't give Germany the energy, resources, and markets it needs. Without the Americans, Germany's economic crisis quickly escalates to a European-wide strategic crisis, where the paths and outcomes are clear to no one. The only certain variable is that the Germans will not lie down and die. For the 4th time in the past 150 years, they will challenge the European status quo. Only time will tell if they will shatter it. The Europeans have 2 neighbors, Turkey and Russia, who are likely to ramp up their pressure on the European periphery in the next decade. For the past decade, a slowly awakening Turkey has played in the Middle Eastern sandbox. And it has discovered that the Middle East is full of intractable issues, bad blood, and above all else, lack of economic benefit. The countries of North Africa, the Levant, and Iraq combined have a smaller combined economic footprint than Spain, a mid-sized European economy. The Middle East is not Turkey's future. Historically, the old Ottoman economic and intellectual heartland wasn't in the Middle East or even in Anatolia. It was in the Balkans, and that's where its future will be as well. Currently, 2 things are holding the Turks back from this path. First, the current regime is new, having been in government for only a decade. They are still learning what works and what doesn't, and most of all, why. Second, NATO and the EU dominate the Balkans, with Slovenia, Greece, Croatia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria all full members of both organizations. So long as the American security umbrella remains functionally in place, and so long as the EU continues existing in its current form, the Turks face limitations in what they can do to their northwest. Both of those barriers exist on borrowed time. The EU is likely to devolve, in the best-case scenario, into more of a glorified free trade zone, but not one with any pretensions to a common foreign or security policy. As for the Americans, their falling interest in the world writ large is something the Turks will be able to scrutinize closely. Turkey is a NATO member. Ankara will be able to detect precisely when the alliance's security guarantees devolve from relevance to mere words on a page. The only question is timing. Russia, by contrast, faces no political or alliance constraints on its ability to pursue a strategic policy to its west. However, unlike Turkey, it does face a time pressure. Russia's demographics are so horrid that if it fails to act before 2022, it will lose the capacity to act both militarily and economically. This puts Russia on a collision course with the 8 EU members on the edge of what the Russians see as their preferred border zone: Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. It would seem that the Russian challenge to Europe's future is rather obvious. Well, yes and no. Yes, in that Russian pressure on places like Ukraine is both palpable and increasing. Yes, in that the emotional state of these 8 European countries ranges from intense concern to panicked paranoia at the rising Russian tide. And yes, in that should Russia follow a piecemeal approach, it can encroach upon Europe's eastern borders without unduly provoking Western Europe's heavyweights. No, in that the reactions of some of these countries to Russian encroachment may be even more injurious to the concept of European unity than the Russians themselves. As the country where the North European plain transitions into the Eurasian hordelands, Poland will decide Russia's success in re-anchoring between the Baltic Sea and the Carpathians. the Poles realize what is at stake and have been taking steps toward a plan for several years. Poland, as Central Europe's largest industrial power and with its largest population, sees itself as the natural leader of the former Soviet satellites who joined the EU and NATO in the 1990s and 2000s. There is more than a small credence to that claim, but the crew that Poland seeks to lead is a motley one. Even after a quarter-century of effort, the region's infrastructure is remarkably fractured. The Baltic states have far better links to Russia, a holdover of the Soviet era, than they do to one another or the Western European region. Romania and Bulgaria are south of the Carpathians and have but one four-lane road that links them to the rest of Europe, and only two bridges that connect them across the Danube, the second of which was only completed in 2013. Slovakia is mountainous. Hungary is really only linked to Austria, and even that connection is pinched by the Vienna Gap. Poland, somewhat ironically, has the best infrastructure linkages of the lot, but those connections are largely due to its position on the North European plain, which in turn ties it directly to both Germany and Russia, the two powers that Warsaw is most concerned about. Making matters worse, nearly all of the former satellites are dependent upon the Russians for both oil and natural gas. An alliance of the Intermarium, the countries between the Baltic and the Black Seas, simply isn't workable. Merely coordinating the actions of such disconnected geographies and heterogeneous cultures would be an endeavor attempted only out of sheer desperation. Without some far more powerful entity, say a rejuvenated European Union or an engaged United States, actively managing such a gangly alliance, the Russians would have a fairly easy time engaging and defeating each of the Intermarium states in sequence and in isolation. That is, with the possible exception of Poland. Despite Poland's largely indefensible position, and despite its potential need to defend against both Germany and Russia, the Poles have a Swedish ace up their sleeve. Since being forced into strategic neutrality at the conclusion of the Great Northern War of 1700 to 1721, Sweden gradually became Europe's forgotten power. While technically a continental power, Sweden boasts water to its south and east, mountains to its west, and taiga and tundra to its north. By most definitions, Sweden operates as a naval power rather than a land power, and as such its military and economic strategies emphasize speed and reach. But they do so in a manner somewhat different from other naval powers. Oceanic-oriented cultures like England and Japan were made famous because they became experts harnessing the wind to cover vast distances over open seas. Their vessels were notable for their relatively small crews, the wind did most of the work, and relatively large cargo areas. Lots of supplies were needed to keep the crew alive on long voyages, and lots of trade goods were needed to justify the trip in the first place. With large, manpower-light vessels, the British needed to interact with the locals right on the coast.